everyone to a nice episode of the Hempy Talks, where we are bringing you different experts from different parts of the world with very interesting and very informative discussions. And this week, I'm very pleased and very honored to have Geoff here joining us very early in the morning and to talk about industrial hemp and investment, which is a topic interesting to so many business owners all over the world. And Geoff wears so many other hats as well that it's going to be a very interesting discussion. So let's dive in and welcome Geoff to the Hempy Talks.
Welcome to everyone that's participating. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
It is the very first question that I love asking people out of curiosity is, how did industrial hemp enter your life? How did you get to know about this plant, and how did you keep on focusing on this plant out of all those many plants available on the planet?
Well, in my case, your podcast may go on for days if I tell the complete story, but ironically, I had the great pleasure of serving under the Prime Minister of Canada in 1979 and was asked to write a speech for the Minister of Health on the importance of considering decriminalization of marijuana. I was quite young at the time and knew very little about the subject, and asked my colleagues at the Canadian Embassy in Washington to send me as much information as they had on what was going on in the United States. That was in 1979, 1980. The speech, I still have it, and I look at it from time to time. The materials that I received from Washington were a little bit confusing because some of them talked about marijuana, some of them were research studies done by, at that time, the U.S. Department of Mental Health. And in that particular case, they had funded a study on the effects of something called cannabinoids in epilepsy. Done by Professor Meshulam out of Israel, but the clinical trial was done on 75 people in Brazil. Fast forward my life, I worked in a lot of government, and then I came back to serve one of them who asked me if I would help build IndyCar racing across Canada. And that then introduced me to a world famous actor by the name of Paul Newman, who owned a race team. And Paul and I became very good friends. Paul Newman is known throughout North America and mostly around the world through using his celebrity to create the Newman's Own products. And those products have benefited charities around the world through the Newman's Own Foundation. So I was involved with Paul on a lot of those issues, although he and I were really focused on other alternative fuels. And when he and I would go out to meetings, we would go to bump into farmers, and he was very excited about farming. I married someone from Pennsylvania, so I moved from Canada to Pennsylvania. We have a very large farm here. And it was within the same 2 weeks that I saw a story on CNN about a woman who had extracted an oil from a marijuana plant that had helped her child mitigate her seizures. And me having a conversation with our farmers saying, why aren't we growing hemp here? And their response to me was a whisper. And they're like, oh yeah, we can't talk about that here. And I'm like, why not? Because after writing that speech in 1979 in Canada, that began the return of industrial hemp, fiber, and grain to our landscape in Canada. So Canada has been growing hemp now for 38 years. And I was surprised to learn that it wasn't legal in the United States. So that was 10 years, almost 11 years ago now, and I decided to take it on. I volunteered to become the chairman of the National Hemp Association. It's now the largest grassroots hemp advocacy group in the world. We have both state members as well as global members, and it's now become a passion.
Yeah, that's a very long history and amazing fact that you're bringing up, which I don't think it's very easy to find just by searching for it. So thank you so much for sharing those. And it's just, I'm really always, every time I ask this question, I'm amazed by the answers of the different ways how people enter into the hemp word. Whenever I say hemp, I mostly think of industrial hemp, you know, the low THC version, but it's still one family, and the variety of uses and the different ways of getting to know the benefits of the plant are just spectacular, saying the least. And
Well, and there was, Beatrix, some irony. Our farm in Pennsylvania is in Berks County, and it sits in between Lancaster and Lehigh counties, and they were the original epicenter for hemp in America, because that is where the Moravians, the Mennonites, and the Amish, who were fleeing religious persecution in Europe, arrived and settled with their own hemp seed. And so, although Lancaster County is what is most recognized as being one of the largest original producers of hemp, there's more than 100 former hemp mills within 50 miles of me. And, you know, I'm ironically living right in the center of it. So it was kind of meant to be. And, you know, I also realized, you know, as a former Canadian, now an American citizen, that farmers around the world and in America are looking for other opportunities. And despite the fact that my homeland really kind of have been leading the way with hemp for fiber and grain, more grain and cold pressed oil or mechanically pressed oil, they're selling $50 to $100 million of that product from Canada into the United States. That should be an opportunity for American farmers, and that's what we pursue.
absolutely. Thank you for adding that. What I love bringing one angle, you know, to the story whenever I invite someone. And in your case, it was when I was browsing on the internet and reading and a little bit educating myself, and I read about replant. And of course, you have many other roles as well. But as I asked you at the beginning, you know, we will focus here on the investment part, because that's the interesting and point to discuss for many of the business owners all around the world. As we are seeing more and more hemp businesses popping up in different countries, and in many countries we also see the revival of the industry as such, it becomes more and more an important question of to ask who would be interested in investing in hemp, either physical or legal entity. What makes it a good investment, because right now it's not a regular commodity just entering. Lots of regulations are still in the making and changing, and implementation is not that quick in every country. And there are a couple of things that I won't mention now, but you might bring it up later on as well, related to investment. But these are the first two questions, maybe just to kick off this conversation around the investment and industrial hemp.
Well, and it's, again, one of those things that we recognize as one of our biggest challenges. You know, when we all came together, and if you're not aware, the 2014 Farm Bill in the United States legalized hemp, but most people think, well, that was the starting point. In fact, it was not. The 2014 Farm Bill was specifically called the Legitimacy of Industrial Hemp Research. And what that legislation did was provide states in the United States who were interested in advancing industrial hemp to do so under their definition of research. And there was no federal oversight at that point. And of course, we accepted it. Senator McConnell was looking to help farmers who were about to lose their subsidies on tobacco. They approached him and were looking to go to a commodity that their great-grandparents grew, and that was hemp. And so I worked with he and his team, and together we worked on that piece of legislation. What we didn't anticipate is that no universities in the United States would even consider taking on industrial hemp research, even though that legislation was passed, because we had not removed hemp from the Controlled Substances Act. And so universities and their legal counsels were saying, we can't take this on, and refused to take it on because their fears were that they would violate federal law and they would lose all the other research funding they were getting from the federal government. So we had to correct that in 2018 with the Industrial Hemp Farming Act. We did that, but we also, again, unforeseen consequences, we really worked the language in that to make sure that the CBD industry, the very industry that I started helping through Paige Figge and Charlotte Figge, that mother-daughter team that I spoke of earlier, and off we went. But there were states that had, like Kentucky, had taken advantage of the 2014 Farm Bill to decide that their definition of research was complete commercial sales of CBD. And then other states found it. And then the industry just started to take off, the CBD industry. And that then caused some significant problems because states weren't sure whether or not they could allow. Law enforcement didn't know whether or not it was legal for people to possess it. And it created a whole bunch of problems that really hijacked the potential of industrial hemp fiber and grain. And that, hearing the stories of the groups that were making millions of dollars off of small horticultural grow, and I kind of now refer to things as industrial agricultural grow versus horticultural grow. But those people who were in the CBD space, the horticultural growers, were making millions of dollars in some cases, and everybody wanted in. And that kind of put fiber and grain off in the corner. So we, have been trying to fix this all the way along. We realized that in order for industrial fiber and grain to succeed, and it has struggled here in the United States, we need to bifurcate the legislation so that there will be separate rules under USDA and in states for farmers who just want to grow this as a typical commodity. We declared it to be a commodity in 2018, but we haven't implemented programs. I think that now we're seeing the whole introduction of synthetically enhanced hemp products coming to the marketplace, them not being regulated by the FDA, states now weighing in and asking for legislation to correct those errors, states closing down the CBD sector because some of it is not conforming to their rules. We are in a serious push to separate the work that we do at the National Hemp Association to advance fiber and grain from that cannabinoid market. And as some of your audience may have seen, we announced that last week, and as of March the 1st, that is our sole focus. So then it comes around to raising money. Part of the problem in raising the money is the very fact that this cannabinoid sector has created such a discussion, a requirement for new legislation, media attention, that bankers just don't know what is and what isn't legal. And so they've just decided to stand on the sidelines. And it's not just bankers. USDA themselves don't know the difference between industrial fiber and grain and hemp horticulturally grown for cannabinoids. So it's a learning process. I do have to say that the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill that gave USDA oversight for this commodity has resulted in, and we have been working with most of them, some 62 countries around the world have now adopted or begun to adopt legislation and regulations. And we are looking at ways that not only we can help countries who can benefit from hemp for protein and grain and animal feed and building materials, we're also looking at ways that we can help stand those sectors up. The discussion that we have had, the realization that I have come to is that we need public-private sector partnerships. And that is why we, in one of my other roles, have taken on through Replant and creating what I call blended finance funds. As you might know, I've worked with a group in creating a large cannabis and hemp company, the largest in the world. There were 34 rounds resulting in about $5.5–6 billion being raised. We were publicly traded. And then my partner and I from that company created a SPAC here in the United States. It was our first Replant fund. We were the very first group ever working with Cantor Fitzgerald, one of the big financial institutes in New York. And it was 3 days into COVID that we were supposed to go and have meetings as you would normally do, doing a so-called road show to raise money. And the world shut down. So I went back to Cantor and said, well, why don't we do this on Zoom? And they said, Geoff, no one's ever raised money on Zoom. And I said, well, we're all sitting at home. Zoom seems to be popular. Let's do it. And in 7 hours versus like 7 weeks on the road, in 7 hours, we were offered $242 million. So we thought, wow, we used that entire, we were only looking to raise 150. We used that as an opportunity to go out and research what was happening in the hemp industry around the world. And ironically, not one company around the world was a company we could invest in. And that happened for a number of reasons. Companies had never gone through an audit process. Companies were using their family accountants to do all of their corporate accountants. No one had the revenues that were required for this particular financial instrument, a SPAC, a special purpose acquisition company that we had created our fund under. We might have been able to combine companies, but even then we couldn't get to the minimum requirement of investing 80% of that money, $120 million, in companies. We would have had to combine 10 companies and take them all public on the same day. Absolutely impossible to do. So we realized that one of the things that we needed to encourage the hemp industry to start looking at is anticipating that 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, you might be approached by a large group that may want to acquire you. You need to have your fiscal house in order, and you need to be able to really demonstrate, where your revenues come from. Most of the companies we looked at, although they might have had revenues of 13, 14 million euros or US dollars, 60% of that money came from cannabinoids. And people, including ourselves, were not interested in standing up the cannabinoid industry. We were looking at standing up the fiber and grain industry. And that requires a huge investment of cash to do so. So we switched gears. We closed on buying a LiDAR technology company in Israel with that money, but we were able to take both BMW and Magna International, who were both involved in the hemp industry, making car parts and certainly incorporating hemp into those products with us in that investment. So we used that money to help further our reach into the automotive sector. So then we decided that our next fund, Replant, would be a venture capital fund, because that's what our industry needs, is venture capital. And again, confronted with all of the same challenges. And although, I've been part of teams that have raised hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, that whole barrier of banks saying, well, is this a safe investment? And although we, have a good reach and we've made some people very wealthy, those groups, whether or not they were family offices, individual investors, were very concerned about whether or not this was going to be a safe investment. Through my discussions with USDA and Congress, We shared with them our biggest challenges. We, worked to make sure that U.S. Treasury had guidance from USDA, knowing that hemp was legal. But that didn't solve the problems in some of the biggest banks, because at the end of the day, and I certainly know what their challenges were, even though hemp was legal, when it comes down from a corporate office, it really comes to one individual at a bank having to decide whether or not the person standing in front of them is in the marijuana business or in the hemp business. And big banks were just not that interested. So after some time, we then were approached by USDA, and USDA told us of a particular program under their rural business initiatives. And it took us 2 years to go through an application and scrutiny, and we created our first Replant America Rural Impact Fund in partnership with the US government. We are one of 12 groups that have been registered in the history of USDA as a joint venture partner with the US government. And that particular fund has what we call a leverage pool. And although that leverage pool has been depleted and it has to be replenished by Congress, and I'm now using my other hats to get Congress to do so, it has the ability for every dollar that we would bring in from the private sector, it would have the ability to match that dollar for dollar. And so that will de-risk the investment. And that's exactly what investors who are thinking about our space find a little more comforting and can ease that burden. Ironically, I have been asked by the British government, now that some consider me to be an expert in blended financing, to speak at a couple of their panels. One of them was at the COP29 conference in Baku, Azerbaijan. And from there, I've been asked to also create a blended fund in Africa, as well as a fund in partnership with a Latin American bank. So we are looking at creating similar funds with blended financing, using groups like Afro-Exim Bank in Africa and CAF in Latin America. So they are slowly coming to reality. It's not easy, but I think we've now figured out a way that we can bring some significant money. In my other, and I'm sorry this is a long answer, but in my other capacity as the chairman of the National Hemp Association, we have taken a look at the past when America had a very large hemp industry, when it was then suddenly prohibited to grow hemp in the United States. But lo and behold, when World War II came around, none of our allies would give us hemp products for the war effort. So the US government said, well, we need to quickly reopen the hemp industry. They did so in less than 6 months. And it was done through an agency that has been around for 100 years. It's called the Commodity Credit Corporation under USDA. And I have all of the receipts, all of the contracts for every one of those investments that they made in 1942 to stand that industry up. So I have now gone back to Congress, and I happen to have our policy book. And one of those asks of Congress is to use the Commodity Credit Corporation yet again to help to stand up the hemp industry as they once did in World War II. And we're asking for the Commodity Credit Corporation, which has the ability to tap into $30 billion a year from the US Treasury, to make available $1 billion, $100 million in each of the next 10 years to help stand up this industry in America.
That's wonderful, unbelievable, and there are many, many adjectives I can add here, but I just truly, I think everything you said, it just really blew my mind, and I'm feeling proud and grateful at the same time. Proud to have somebody like you who who is standing up for industrial hemp and really understanding how it can be implemented into countries. When we think of governments, when we think of the private sector, the financing tools and all of those, and thinking global in a good way, how it can be happening at the national level, in the country level. So that's I really loved the example, and I especially loved the history link when you brought up the example from the Hemp for Victory, and using those tools, using that, learning from history and not just repeating mistakes that we didn't learn. So I was very happy and very pleased to hear all of that. And surely, lots of people, and I really hope lots of people and lots of company owners will reach out to you for an individual discussion as well. But I think we, on behalf of many industrial hemp business owners all over the world, I can say how much grateful we are that somebody is doing this work, who is knowledgeable, has the expertise, and has the goodwill for this as well. So let me ask you the last question before we are going to end the podcast. And that's because it's happening live. We are going to open the floor for a very nice discussion. Is where do you see the industrial hemp industry in 10 years?
Well, actually, Beatrix, I am asked that question often, and I've got a pretty good answer. And if you will bear with me, I see that over the next 5 years, we will be continuing to advance research on industrial hemp. We certainly will be advancing legislation at the same time. 10 years from now, we will be well on our way to a multi-billion-dollar global industry, which we at the National Hemp Association have actually estimated to be worth about $15 trillion, the total addressable market for industrial hemp. And 20 years from now, when I probably will be long gone, I think the discussion will be, well, what was the big deal? Because hemp should be everywhere as everyone's everyday life.
Absolutely brilliant answer, and thank you so much for that. And having said that and having these answers, I hope I really raise enough awareness of the amazing work you are doing. And I would encourage everybody just to check out Geoff Whaling as a profile, and you will find lots of and many other different activities that Geoff is involved in. And I would encourage you to reach out to follow his activities as well. And this would be it for now, for this week, from the Hempy Talks. And thank you so much, Geoff, for joining. And for the next episode, I'm going to again bring you somebody from a part of the world who is going to share another interesting and exciting story about industrial hemp with you. Thank you, Geoff, for being here.
My pleasure.